Welcome to the Communicating Earth podcast by Climate Acceptance Studios. This is the podcast by and for climate and nature communicators. This week, Dina Cappiello was, until recently, Chief Communications Officer at the Rocky Mountain Institute, or RMI, which transforms global energy systems through market-driven solutions to secure a prosperous, resilient, clean energy future. She also has a strong journalistic background. She wrote for Congressional Quarterly and the Associated Press, amongst many others. She also taught journalism at Georgetown University in Washington. She went on to become editorial director for Edelman. I'm very interested in finding out more about her career switch in 2021 because I think it might mirror my own. As well as RMI, she was also co-host of the Webby-nominated Climate Now podcast and an advisor to clean energy platform Canary Media. And she also believes, as I do, that storytelling can change the world. Dina, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you so much for a podcast devoted to climate communications. It's desperately needed.
Yeah. It seems to have a good response so far, and I agree it's desperately needed. So storytelling, I mean, I agree with you. Why do you think that storytelling can change the world?
Because listen, I mean, we have been studying this issue, climate, for a really, really long time, right? And we know, and now not only do we know all the science and the data and the numbers, but we're all experiencing climate change, right? Whether it's these freak shifts in weather or blackouts or what have you. And it's not working, right? The data and the research, if that was all we had to communicate, we would be much farther along in solving the climate crisis. And so I think you really need to connect emotionally and move people and inspire people to act on the solutions. And the only way to do that is storytelling. You know, as a journalist, one of the primary things that you always have to answer is the so what, who cares for the audience, right? And getting to that, connecting to what people care about, what the audience you're trying to reach cares about is absolutely essential to move people on this issue.
So with that driving force of storytelling power, and you're a person who's obviously worked in both the first, second, and third sectors, right? You're public, private, and journalism.
Yep.
Uh, Tell me about the sort of the differences you've noted in the different stages of your career when you've moved between those sectors.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a great question. I remember very vividly my first day at Edelman, and when I reached out to Edelman for an opportunity to work there, my only experience with PR was being pitched, right, as a journalist. And one of the first meetings I was in, they were talking about story. And from my journalism background, it wasn't really stories. I was like, wait a minute, like, what's the story? Right? Stories show, they don't tell. And PR does a lot of telling, and marketing does a lot of telling, right? And so my first inclination was that in the PR field, even at like an esteemed firm like Edelman, um, I I had a different definition of story than they did, and I brought that in to my communications and my communication strategies. Um, I think the so what, who cares for many clients sometimes is what they want to get out. And it's kind of like a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down, right? You just can't feed somebody medicine. You have to wrap it in a story to get it consumed. And so that was a real eye-opening experience, and that's what I did at Edelman is help with a lot of other colleagues to get up and running a storytelling function and training clients on how to storytell. I mean, clients have huge opportunities to storytell because they have access, right? That nobody has to their own companies to tell amazing stories about the people in those companies that are doing
Thanks.
amazing things. And then I think in the NGO side of things, um, it's interesting, you know, at RMI, we were really pressing and they continue to press there in my absence to do storytelling. and we do a lot of on the ground work in communities in places around the world like India and Africa. And it was really hard to extract those stories in the NGO space, which is so hyper focused on like the research and the analysis. Um, and also trying to convince the experts, the researchers and the analysts and the scientists and the engineers that storytelling wasn't necessarily dumbing down their research or analysis, right? Um, and so I think those are kind of the threads. And as a former teacher, which I also was, and to me, all of this makes sense, even though it makes maybe chaotic sense. um, uh, it's like everybody in that classroom needs to know algebra, right?
Hmm.
But if you only teach it in one way, you're going to not teach people, everybody in that room, the core concepts of algebra. And I think that communications is very similar, right? You want to get the message across, but you have to package it in different ways and in different formats to reach the people that you want to reach.
The thing that I picked up on that I found most interesting then, that's simply from personal experience, because we are basically almost exclusively working with NGOs, and as a video production company, we're trying to tell those stories effectively. Is your perception that they see it perhaps as a dumbing down option? I mean, is that true? Tell me more about that.
Yeah, when I first got, and I've been working on this my whole entire career. I went to Columbia for my a dual master's in earth and environmental science journalism. So I spent my first year with the scientists and my second year with the journalists, right? And one of the things that we did
Okay.
was we looked at the scientific paper and then the journalistic translation. And there's always been that tension, right? That as you translate something to be more consumable, the scientists kind of bristle and get nervous and, oh, wait, but that's not what I'm really trying to say. And I think that the best communication really is perfect translation. So, yeah, there were times, you know, in the NGO world and at RMI where when I first got there, they were very accustomed to having their papers and their analysis, which is obviously top notch, communicated exactly as they put it in their white paper, right? So it was an education to get them and to talk like humans. And we actually did a curriculum at RMI that we said, talk like a human. We had hats. Our team had baseball hats that we got made. And we were called the influence team because I wanted to educate internally and raise awareness internally for what our function was, which is to influence the hearts and minds of our audience, right? Um, so we did a whole curriculum on talking like humans and used research and brought in external experts. Um, and that went a long way, I think, to kind of what we were hoping to accomplish. But again, when I first got there, I would get calls about literally words like in an Instagram post. Like,
Okay.
wait, you can't say that way. You have to say it this way, right? And just working with them to understand that we are not trying to dumb down or simplify your research. We are actually just trying to translate it in ways that people understand. And with attention spans short and people always multitasking, right? Um, you need to make it consumable quickly. And in order to do that, you need to translate it.
And did it work? Did the hats work?
Yeah, I mean, I think that over the 5 years that I was at RMI and it continues, under the very capable team that's there, and many that I hired, yes, they were getting it because they understood the impact. So they understood the reach, right? And we did a lot with metrics to show them that it was working, to show that, hey, by translating it at the highest level on social media platforms, we were driving people to your analysis, right? It was a portal. And that's what our charge was. Our charge at the NGO at RMI was to get people interested enough to drive deeper into the research because that is where the solutions lie, right? And we wanted to capture more people because we want more people to act on those solutions.
So I had a client literally last week say to me, I want to explore how we can make our scientists sound less boring. That's a direct quote. So how would you respond to a question like that?
Tell them, do you speak this way to your grandmother? I once told my former CEO that I worked with, I said, do you speak like this at your house? Can I come sit at your kitchen table and hang out and see like how you speak? I again, talk to your mother, talk to your partner. How would you communicate it to them? um, get out of this. I think sometimes people who are super smart, and there's so many super smart people in this space doing amazing things, that they're more sometimes interested in sounding smart than they are trying to be relatable, right? And I think relatable goes a long way, right? That's the people that people remember, right? It's not what you say, it's how you make people feel. And I
Exactly,
think
exactly.
and I think that there's a risk, right? There's a risk, especially now that, and I said this a lot to my RMI colleagues, that that you can come across exclusive and you can come across as talking down, and that unfortunately, whether it's intentional or not, fuels this, misconception that's out there driven by our opponents and the right, that we are elitist, right? We are the liberal elite.
Mm.
Um, that's not helpful right now. I think we really need to figure out a way to be more inclusive with our communications because we don't know who is out there that could help us change the world.
So our theory of change here is based around the work of a neuroscientist and indeed former filmmaker, a guy called Chris Mayer, who works out of UCL. He's just done a TED talk recently, and it's based around the principle of it's stories specifically of action that inspire action.
Yes.
And this is the framing for the whole podcast. So what I'd love to do is, do you have a particular, your own personal story of action from your career that you can share with our audience of climate communicators around the world as a case study, if you will? So what springs to mind? What's that story of action, do you think?
Yeah. Well, first of all, amen to what you just said. I totally agree. Like, you have to show
Very
people
good.
that it can be done, and it's possible. And RMI, as a solutions driven org, was really, really, lightning focused on showing solutions in action. And so we did it in a really, really big way. So the example that comes to mind is, um, in advance of Climate Week this past year, we were working on a video about the retrofits that RMI inspired at the Empire State Building, right? And I loved this. It was not new, right? This was not something we did recently. This goes kind of way back into RMI's legacy and the work of its co-founder, Amory Lovins, who's the Einstein of energy efficiency. And it was about a couple things. It was about making energy efficiency sexy. I don't think there's a communicator out there that's like, "Woo, I want to communicate about energy efficiency." Like, people just like go to sleep, right? Um, but that's the bread and butter of RMI, right? We were talking about efficiency since our birth 40 years ago. And and then it's the Empire State Building. It's this iconic building that's larger than life, that for many years
Mm.
was the tallest building in the biggest, most famous city on earth, right? Like New York, right? It can happen there, it can happen anywhere, right? The Frank Sinatra song, right? If you make it here, you make it anywhere. So I loved that, like that symbolism. And we worked with the Empire State Building, Realty Trust, to get access to the building and to film for a day in this amazingly empty floor. Just imagine one floor of the Empire State Building just like totally empty. You realize how massive it is, to tell the story of the retrofits, and it incorporated changing out the windows, and the windows were produced on site. And we called the video, "The Sky is the Limit," because I wanted to convey that if this building, right, this huge building that is in movies and like people just know and changes color when like the Mets or the Yankees or the Knicks win, people understand what it is, can do it. You can do it in your house. Anybody can do it, right? Um, because it's actually easy and it actually saves a lot of money. And so to hear, Tony Malkin on the video say, "This saved us a ton of money," right? Also counteracts this notion that doing moving to clean energy, using less energy is expensive and cumbersome, right? Which we hear all the time. And the fact is that it saves money relatively fast. And so um that was a story of mega action. And I think in a weird way, it really captivated people because it was that building. And whoever you are, you understand that building and what it means. And I wanted to make it like an emblem for energy efficiency, in a way. Uh, so yeah, that's the story. And I remember being in this. I'm a big skier. I remember being in a ski store outside of DC where I live, and talking to somebody about what I do, and he's like, "Oh my god, I just saw this Empire State Building a video about efficiency." It's like, "Oh, we did that. I did that. That was my idea," right? And obviously with huge help from my teammates, to get it done. And it wasn't easy to get done. It was a lot of discussions with the Empire State folks, a lot of edits with the Empire State folks. But I think it turned out really well, and it was one of the things I was most proud of, at RMI, is telling that story, because I think it's so inspirational, and it coincided with, a refocus at the organization on our commitment to energy efficiency, right? You want to triple up renewables, double down on double energy efficiency, and that gets the short shrift, right? Everybody wants to build things. It's sexy, right? Wind plants, solar plants. We love more, right?
Hmm.
Everybody loves more. People don't like use less. But the fact is that half of the emissions that we've reduced, greenhouse gas emissions that we've reduced and cut, have come from energy efficiency improvements. You can't build your way out of this, right? Um, so for all those reasons, we did it, and it was hugely popular. It was one of our, the video was seen. I don't know the exact numbers, but many, many, many times. One of our most popular posts ever. Um, and just, great videography from a contractor we hired to work with us to do it. And so, yeah, it was awesome.
So you said, but you hinted that some of it wasn't easy. So what were the? And I get a sense actually it was probably maybe political challenges that you were facing. So tell me a bit more about that. Like what were the challenges that you faced?
Yeah,
The negotiations you had to have. Like why did it have to go through rounds of changes? What was the pushback you were getting from the Empire State Building folks?
yeah. I mean, one of the big things is, that was discussed, and rightly so, and this is always an issue, is how much credit does RMI take for doing this, right? We weren't the only player in there, right? There was a huge amount of will on the part of the Empire State Building to reduce their energy use, right? And
Hmm.
so that's always delicate. I think, in telling these stories is how much you thump your own chest, right? So being very, very careful to be accurate and not oversell our role. Um, Amory Lovins, our co-founder, and Tony Malkin know each other, and that relationship really was behind the retrofits that happened at the Empire State Building, and it was very inspiring. And Tony Malkin is a huge Amory fan. He, came up during the filming and after his interview and was like chit chatting with Amory. So those kind of issues, and you're really promoting two brands there, the Empire State Building and RMI. Uh, and, making sure that we got the clip they wanted of Tony. These are basic things, like nothing untoward. And then we had, just some, you know, legal issues between sign off from them and us, just like those kind of like back
Mm.
administrative stuff that made it really, really, really took much longer than we anticipated. So we used it in our lead up to Climate Week this past year. Uh, it took about a year to get done, so it took a while to get
Wow.
everything across the finish line. Yeah.
I think within our sector, isn't there? There's a lot of collaboration. There's a lot of projects that have many stakeholders involved. And I'd be interested for you to tell our audience of climate communicators maybe some like tips and tricks, because you're obviously, former chief communications officer of a leading US organization. I would imagine managing quite high stakes relationships. So, what advice would you give to other communications out there who are brokering at the center of point between a number of organizations? What sort of tactics did you use, or what's your overall strategy for sort of managing that process?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And, collaboration is one of the main ways RMI gets a lot of things done. So we found ourselves at the center of a lot of projects that were multiple partners. And I think that it's challenging. I'm not gonna lie. I mean, we are all, you know, competing for similar funds. In what is a shaky philanthropic space right now. And my advice is to get to be to get buy-in early, to kind of lay out the strategy, what you're trying to communicate early. So, we in the Empire State case, we did internally creative briefs at RMI, much like an agency would do, getting sign off from all the parties involved on the idea, right, from the outset. Um, Getting a script, uh, transcript at the time after doing before we even cut the video, we shared what we were thinking in terms of how it would be cut and how it would be pieced together. So literally communicating every step of the way so there are no surprises. And also, and this I think is super important, you know, what's in it for them to tell this story, right? Whether it's the Empire State Building or other NGOs, right? And in the NGO space, when we're kind of trying to herd the NGO cats and communicate. I think it's important to always come back to the reason why cooperation and coordination is valuable, because it ultimately drives more impact. If we're all speaking with one voice, it's going to be more powerful, more resonant, reach more people, um, and drive more impact. And also just reminding everybody that we're all in it for the same thing, right? Which is to alleviate the climate crisis, right? We're all the same. The goal is the same for
Yeah,
everybody.
exactly. Exactly.
And sometimes I think when we get into these debates, we like forget that. Um, I have this like remarkable like anecdote where I was at COP this past year in Brazil, and I was in the media room, and I was looking at all of the events. And I mean, there were so many events that you could not process as a
Yeah.
human being, right? The scrolling was so fast because there were so many events and there was so much overlap in those events. Like, how many methane events do we need? Why are we doing 25 methane events when all of us want to just reduce methane because it's a very potent greenhouse gas, right? Why don't we connect the dots and do one big thing versus 25 small things? Now, there's some value to that if you are going after different audiences, right? But then you need to be very, very clear on what the message is, right? To those different audiences. So that just really struck me. And I remember being a journalist in those rooms and being like, where do I go? What do I do today? There is so much to consume where it would be so much more effective and efficient, right? Talking about human energy, human capital,
Mhm.
um, to actually do it in one big way. Then everybody would be clear, right?
Well, that's the principle of this podcast, right? I totally agree with you. No matter where we work and what we do, ultimately everybody is unified by the same thing, which is reducing carbon emissions and biodiversity loss. It's just
Yes.
there as a unifying force. And I believe passionately that a climate communications professional that's working in built environment or climate justice or whatever it might be will listen to this podcast and take some value from your work and what you do within the specifics of the projects within your vertical, right? So, because ultimately we are unified with the same aim. So I couldn't agree more. It's one of the reasons why I established this podcast in the first place. Um, well, look, so we have what we call our quickfire round, although I've now rechristened it our medium fire round because my guests so far find it hard to give short answers because there's so much to say. But let's give it a go. Are you ready for our medium sized quickfire round
Oh,
now,
sure.
Dina?
Sure.
Brilliant. Okay, so here we go. What's the first word that comes to mind when I say climate?
Everything. It's everything, right? I mean, it's so massive, and affects so many things. Um, that's what I think. It's everything. Um,
Who's your greatest inspiration in the climate and nature communications world?
I mean, I'm a huge fan of Catherine Hayhoe. I'm sure a lot of your guests probably bring her up, but someone who is a scientist, um, an evangelical from a state like Texas, um, and relates to people and does it in an amazing way.
Is there someone's work that you think needs to get more attention than it's currently getting?
Yeah, I'm a really big fan of Sammy Roth. He was at the LA Times and now he has a Substack called Climate Colored Goggles. And
Okay.
it's talking about uh how climate and culture intersect. And so yeah, I think he's really covering climate in I think a really fresh way and is somebody to check out for sure.
Interesting you say culture, because the next question is, what is your favorite piece of climate related culture, be it a book, a movie, or a TV show?
So I'm gonna go like deep in the archives for this one. I mean, I obviously have like a ton, but the first thing that came to mind was the film Microcosmos. I'm not sure if you've ever seen that film, but
Okay.
it is. It was not about climate, right? It's about nature, and literally the filmmakers put cameras in a field, a meadow, and let them run. And so you see nature more up close than you've ever seen it. And it's miraculous, right? And I think to me, that like pulls at my heartstrings. And that's one of the reasons why I do what I do and I'm mission aligned. But it's so beautiful. And it's this view that you walk in a meadow and you don't see anything, but when you get down to the microscopic level and you see nature working in what is just like, a field of grass, it opens your eyes, in a way that, I think is special and moving.
Very good. Well, we'll dig that out and put that in the show notes for people to find. So this next question, basically everybody says face to face, so you're not allowed to say face to face. But apart from face to face, what's your favorite communications channel?
I'm such a Gen Xer. so
Okay,
so
me too.
so so I mean, I my kids make fun of me. I still like Facebook personally. Um uh Maybe not for climate, but for RMI it was LinkedIn. That was our most popular channel because we, communicate to experts and to people that are on that platform. So we got, most of our traction there. I'm not on X much anymore. I When I was a journalist, I was, on Twitter, then Twitter like forever. Um, but yeah, I would say in terms of the social networks, Facebook. I like podcasts too. Not just tooting your horn, but I do like podcasts as well. And listen to them quite a bit. Even ones like The Daily, which I love The Daily by the New York Times. Sometimes it's about climate, sometimes it's not. But yeah, audio because I've got not a lot of time, and you can do it in the car, you can do it whenever, right?
So is that your number one source of climate information? Then do you go to podcasts to find out about new stuff?
I mean, I'm still a media junkie, right? I'm a journalist, and I woke up for 15 years and read all the press on climate and energy topics. So I kind of still do that, like,
Okay.
right? And since I was an AP reporter, it was my competitor. So it was like the New York Times, the Journal, the Post, in Washington Post. I do subscribe to a lot of newsletters that do kind of give me the rundown of the climate related happenings.
So what's your favorite? Recommend one to the audience. What's the first one that springs to mind? Just one.
Well, I mean, it used to be Climate Nexus, right? Which is no more, but
Very sad.
GSCC has one. There's a bunch out there, and there's some by invite, right? Catherine Hayhoe distributes one. I mean, if you go on LinkedIn, there's a ton that you can subscribe to that just come into your feed. So I would encourage people, my whole LinkedIn feed now is climate. It's like insane. Like I would not miss anything just based on that. But there's a ton of those that are now doing newsletters via LinkedIn. So I would encourage them to go there and not accept every invite, but there's a lot of great newsletters there.
What's that one piece of misinformation or climate myth that you wish you could scrub from the face of the earth?
Oh my God, only to pick one. Oh my
Just
God.
one.
I'm going to say that there's so many right now because I can't. But I'm going to say that clean energy is expensive,
Yeah.
right? And costly is especially now with the cost of living. I mean, hey guys, look what's happening to oil prices. Hello. Um, so that one and that goes back to my reporting days, which is now 11 years ago, where even when I was a reporter, getting these warring reports like, it's cheap, it's expensive, it's cheap, it's expensive. And like, I think now with cost of living and affordability and blackouts in places like Cuba that rely on a certain infrastructure and fossil fuels for their power, clean energy is the alternative, and that is what we should be putting out there and selling.
Very good. And if you need to think about it just for 5 seconds, it's obvious, right? You've got something that basically, once you've set up the infrastructure, is free non-stop with very little maintenance for 40 years versus having to dig something up for a one-time use. It's just
There's
it's sort
no
of
Strait of
remarkable.
Hormuz in clean energy, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I guess there could be a future where there is a pathway like the Strait of Hormuz for the parts that make clean energy coming from other parts of the world. But I don't see it as vulnerable, right, as fossil fuel infrastructure is.
Okay, let's return back to your career. So I basically personally went through a journey. I was working for a consulting firm that was supporting BP and supporting the Heathrow expansion, and the weight of the evidence became too much to bear, and I eventually quit. And I wrote a 2,000-word resignation letter where I detailed all the various ways in which the clients we were supporting through our change management and digital transformation programs were destroying the planet. And they replaced me with their first ever sustainability manager. So I suppose I maybe had some sort of impact. But obviously Edelman is quite a controversial firm. Recently it was recruited to be the PR firm for COP30 and got a lot of, United Nations got a lot of pushback from that. I mean, is that and I see that from 21, you've gone into RMI, Canary Media, and so on. Is that a similar story for you? I mean, was there like a deliberate choice to sort of move away from Edelman for ethical grounds, or what was the story of the journey there?
Well, yeah, I'm happy to share. Well, first off, I'm going to say that RMI is a very pragmatic organization. It's very center. It's nonpartisan, and I loved it. And will always love it because of that. Because I really do believe that you have to work with the people that are emitting these pollutants to actually get traction and change the planet, right? You can't say, guys, you're out of this. Not only it's just they have the technology, they have the smarts. You have to work with them to get them to move in the right direction. So I firmly believe that you just can't ignore them entirely and say you're not going to work with them. I think where the rubber meets the road is, are you working with them on things that move them in the direction to cleaner operations, more efficient operations, or are you working with them to protect their license to operate and business as usual, right?
Hmm.
And I think that's where Edelman historically has gotten into trouble, right? Is um I think there were people within Edelman that felt that they were speaking out of both sides of their mouth. Um, Even though, you know, uh, they were obviously, we didn't work for coal. There were some lines, for sure. I mean, listen, the rubber met the road for me. When I was at Edelman, I wasn't really looking for a job. And I got a call during the Biden transition, to be considered for the EPA, public affairs position, um, head of public affairs for the Environmental Protection Agency. For those who are not U.S. based, the big federal environmental agency here in the U.S. And I would listen. I would. It's just not. I mean, as you can see from my varied career, I like different experiences. It would be kind of cool to
Uh-huh.
work on in the government, and I covered the EPA all 15 years of my journalism career. And so I got through the interview process, and it got to the ethics portion, and I had to submit and disclose all of my clients, and some of my clients were fossil fuels, although for many of them, it had nothing to do with like protecting their license to operate. It was sustainability storytelling. It was helping them reorganize their comms function. Um, so nothing related to being anti greenhouse gas, or denying the existence of climate change, which also at my time was a bright red line for Edelman. um, is refuting the science of climate change was a no-go. So anyway, I had about 12%, I remember the percentage actually, of my hours that I was working for, fossil fuel clients or entities, so a small fraction. And the transition team at that time was very uncomfortable with it, and it prevented me from getting that job. And that was a real wake up call. And I was like, wait a minute, like I just spent my career um, 15 years of it, uh, reporting on the environment, on energy, on climate. Um, Obviously, the change, although I'm not an advocate, I don't consider myself an advocate. I All of that reporting was about educating people to make better choices, right? Um, and a lot of it had to do with the pollution around fossil fuels, whether that's from automobiles, tailpipes, or point sources like refineries and power plants. And I didn't want to be branded like that. And so I went back to some of my bosses at Edelman, and again, this was the time where we were transitioning to Biden, and said, relayed my experience, which probably wasn't super smart because I was like, "Oh, I'm looking for another job," which I wasn't actively. This just kind of fell in my lap. Um, and said, "Guys, listen, like, I just want you to know that this is like really serious." And I got, stricken from this role because of a very small percentage of my work being attached to fossil fuels. We work for fossil fuels as a firm. Um, and I think that we also need to make our clients aware of how much scrutiny this particular sector is going to come under in a Biden White House. And um, it didn't, and well, you relayed your case. It didn't really change much in my view. And so that's what I said. You know what? I I don't I don't wanna close off any doors to me, and that's when I, broke up with Edelman, and I did some consulting right away. I worked for, the World Bank on a project, and then shortly after that, I got the RMI job, which, I was very grateful for, and also was exactly what I was looking for, and also a different experience working for an NGO, coming from the private sector. The funny thing is when you're like me, Tom, and you have worked on energy and environment your whole career, this goes back, I graduated from grad school. I'll age myself in 99. I've been working on it since then and exclusively. When I was a journalist, I had to move to different places because to get different stories, and now in communications, I like this notion of, yeah, I worked for a PR firm. Like, I would not have been able to do my Edelman job, my RMI job, without working at Edelman, because I learned so much
Uh,
from some of the best in the business about what amazing PR client service is about. Um, there's no way I could have leapfrogged from journalism to CCMO at an organization like RMI. No way without that PR experience. So
um,
grateful, even though, um, it didn't end as I anticipated at Edelman. They, did it end at RMI as I anticipated. So that happens in life. And Yeah, uh, uh, that's what I learned. I just didn't want to be tarnished.
I mean, I've personally worked in the full spectrum, right? I've worked for the arts, I've worked for public sector, private sector, and within the environmental space, I've worked, at the activism end. I've supported business, I've supported non-violent civil disobedience, and everything in between. I'm a big believer that again, we've all got the same goal, and we should all be working together, and that my activist friends, would be perhaps not supportive of some of the work I've worked with sustainable business. And similarly, some people in sustainable business might, be turned off by my support on, non-violent civil disobedience. But ultimately we all have the same goal. And I think we all need to be looking outward and facing, the real problem, which is the fossil fuel industry and the stranglehold it has over the world economy right now, and the fact that we're sort of careering towards disaster as a consequence. Um, so yeah, so I do empathize. Do you think that the fossil fuel industry needs to be in a I'm not suggesting in a sort of I'm not stretching in a sort of 1776 type of way, but it needs to be sort of overthrown, or does it need to be changed from within?
That's a good question. I mean, I don't think it's gonna be overthrown. I don't have much hope for
Yeah.
that. Um, Listen, I mean, I lived in Houston for 5 years, and I do think that it's very hard to do it from within. But there are employees that want to do it, right? Hiring for some fossil fuels companies is really, really hard because the new generations don't want to work for them, right? So I think change from within is going to be inevitable, right? I mean, gasoline consumption is flatlining, right? That's a major product. They're going to go to plastics. Um, I don't. I mean, listen. I guess you need both forces, and there's organizations that are out there to try to overthrow. Um, and there is organizations like RMI, which work within, um, and try to give them advice to act on, non loaded, non biased about advice. And I think that both are needed. Um, I mean, I think the real thing from the communications perspective is is how are we gonna match what they do in the communication space, right? They are so far ahead, so much more resources, um, that it's really hard for us, I think, to how do we combat that narrative that they are so effective at putting out, right? Those
Well,
misconceptions.
we are winning though. Climate science
Yes.
denial is over, and there's been a shift over instead to climate delay and the
Yes.
bullshit that is net zero transition being incredibly expensive. I mean, in a podcast the other day I recorded, there was a very interesting point made. Like, why is there a cost assigned to the net zero transition? You wouldn't do it with anything else. Aside from the fact it's already been proven it's going to be way cheaper than business as usual. Um, but yeah. So okay. So let's finish off with the final big question, which is a thought experiment. And you've got the ear currently of the climate and nature communication community of the world. If you could say, look, just do one thing, just follow one strategy across sector, across region, size of organization, what's that one thing that you think all of your fellow climate nature communication teams around the world should be doing? They should start tomorrow. What would that strategy be?
To me, it would be better coordination and alignment. I'm not saying we all have to speak and be a broken record for each other, but to come together and work together to communicate at least in the same direction, right? Like ships sailing in the same direction. There has to be a North Star. Right now, I think it's death by a thousand cuts, right? And people don't even know what to orient to because there are so many things coming at them, right? And that's a consequence of the world being what it is. But and all of us being busy. I spent 5 days recently in Mexico on a meditation retreat, and one of the things that really spoke to me that I think is so interesting given what I do for a living, what everybody listening to this podcast does for a living is attention is a moral act. So how can we grab their attention, right? How can we produce content that just they just can't take their eyes off or their ears off? And you're right, we have one on climate denialism, and that's great. I think the next step is, how do we get the adoption of solutions? How do we get people to adopt the solutions that we know exists? So I'm hoping, and to me, that's being a more coordinated, together movement, knowing that some know certain audiences better than others, and making it more of an organism, an ecosystem that works together. Because I can tell you from experience, the fossil fuel industry works together.
So, can you define what one of those directions might be? Can you pinpoint, like, how would you define a direction? What direction would that be?
Well, I mean, listen, I think two things, two possibilities. I think, when, uh, seeing from the US perspective, when 67% of American households are living paycheck to paycheck, literally, right? Or are $400 away from a catastrophic, right, financial burden. We have to make it about the kitchen table. So I think affordability, right? Making this good, right? In the sense of economics and helping you combat the high prices. And now the time is now, right? Because I hate to say it, we have now rising oil prices because of the war in the Middle East. Um, I think that affordability message is very strong, and I think
Definitely, I've thought about that already. It's from a communication standpoint, it's a tremendous opportunity.
100%. And then, for a different audience, it's um it's also about security. I mean, it's just mind blowing to me, and I've been at this for a very long time, that 20% of our oil supply can be shut off, right? Pretty easily, right? The world's oil supply. Obviously, most of that oil goes to Asia, not to the US. Or a country like Cuba uh, can go black, can go into a blackout. Um, and I think that we have a hard time sometimes, like, even relating to that. But imagine if you were living in Cuba and you had no power, no lights. Um, a lot of people are living in energy poverty across the world. And so I think bringing that story to life, you know, um, what would be your life without electricity? Um, and right now, whether it's cost related or the fact that you're literally like cut off, there are many people struggling with that.
Mm. Well, look, I'd love to end it there. And so I understand that you've in the middle of a career break. But is there anything on your to-do list coming up that is related to climate communications that you're doing anyway? Like, what's the next thing you're going to be doing, climate related, communications
Well,
related?
I'm gonna be doing some consulting in the middle term. And listen, I'm looking for a role that allows me to have an impact in what I think is some of the communications issues that have prevented us from being farther along, right, in addressing the climate crisis. I think it's a communications crisis too, and just especially with solutions. Um, so yeah, later today I'll be on a call with a small group of people that are going to be talking about how we maybe get the movement more aligned on climate communications, and how could that happen, and could we get funding for it? And so I'm doing that on a voluntary basis, 'cause I think, as I said, it's so important, especially now, um, to come together, in some kind of loose knit ecosystem, organism, whatever you want to call it, to try some of these things.
Brilliant. Well, look, Dina, I really appreciate our time. Thank you so much. And yeah, the best of luck in aligning more sections of the movement together. Uh, Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for having me. It was such a fun chat.